Hello, this is Tanya McCausland, COO at Diamond Six Leadership and Strategy. Our focus at Diamond Six is to learn from the past to prepare for the future. And so we use history, remarkable events, inspiring people, and stories to learn how we can continue to be better leaders, colleagues, community members, and humans. As we near the 20th anniversary of 9/11, we felt it would be most appropriate for us to recall and remember some of the stories and people that can get missed or easily forgotten in the big headlines. The unlikely leaders, the people who didn't have the official leader title, but stepped up through the unimaginable. And although it is still a very hard and somber day, it is also one that we must remember. I recently sat down with our friend Tom McMillan, author of Flight 93, The Story, the Aftermath, and the Legacy of American Courage on 9/11. Quite honestly, I was a bit hesitant to take a close look at Tom's book and discuss the events of 9/11 with him. At a time when our world feels so heavy and overwhelmed with tragedy, I wasn't sure I could bear adding more sadness. But I was wrong in my hesitation. Rather than be overwhelmed by sadness, I was inspired by the acts of courage and empathy individuals showed during and after the tragedy. Rather than feel helpless and hopeless, I was reminded of our humanity and ability to persevere through the most difficult of circumstances. To me, these acts of courage, empathy, humanity, and perseverance are important reminders of not only this story, they are reminders of how we can and should act in the days, months, and years to come in the telling of our ongoing story. Thank you for watching this interview with Tom McMillan.
All right, well, Tom, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today as we obviously come upon the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Obviously a very somber day, but an important one for us to continue to remember and talk about. You wrote a book called Flight 93, The Story, the Aftermath, and the Legacy of the American Courage on 9/11, which, by the way, for anyone knows, this is what it looks like. I have one copy right here. And it came out in 2014, I believe, right?
Yes.
And it's the retelling of the flight that went down in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. And from what I can tell and that I've seen, it is still read, reread, and most referred to as the most accurate telling of the events that took place in Somerset County and that events that took place for Flight 93. Would you say that that's probably accurate, right? You are the preeminent expert on this story, from my
It's odd thinking of yourself that way, but it's amazing to me, Tanya, even 20 years, there have only been 2 books written about Flight 93. And the first one was written by a reporter from the New York Times, but it came out within a year after the crash. So not much was known back then. He did a really good job, and a lot of it's on the emotion of the families. We just didn't know much. So since then, my book was the only one, and it was part of the motivation for doing it. Like, who am I to write a book? But nobody else was going to do it. As I talked to people, that's what they said. You have to, we need someone to try to capture this, because it's, but I also learned of the challenge of writing contemporary history. It's not like writing about the Civil War, which I also do, which is 150 years ago, but people are still alive who were involved and affected by it. And there will be a time when those first generation family members aren't alive anymore. So to get their stories now was really important. It was part of the motivation. So I think that's why it's kind of carried through. Why there's been so little written, I don't know. And you kind of hope as you go on that somebody will build on what you did, and that may happen someday. And I'd be proud if that happened, but to this point, it hasn't. So I guess I carry the banner, and I'm proud to do that.
And I have to say, I think you saying that about, because it's contemporary history, people are still alive to tell their stories, which is important, because you can, obviously, family members that you can talk to about these people that you write about is important, but it's also a huge responsibility, because everyone needs to be heard and understood, and have the opportunity to tell their story. So kudos to you, I think, also by taking on a huge responsibility.
Well, and there's a challenge. Thank you. There's a challenge too, because unlike writing about the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, people alive reading your book experienced this, and therefore they read the coverage, they watched the coverage, they have in their minds what the story is. And when I talk about the book is most people, what they think the story of Flight 93 is the stories they heard in the first 7 to 10 days, because we were all just so consumed by it. But then at some point you had to move on with the rest of your life. And I learned this way back in journalism school. Often reporting early in a major tragedy, major crisis, there are some incorrect parts of it because even the authorities don't know what happened. They're sorting it out. So the media is doing the best they can, but stories get out there that are later corrected. All these things have been corrected, but people have moved, time has moved on, and a lot of people don't know that. I hear a lot of people using the urban myths, you know, that the hijackers' main weapon was box cutters, that the calls came from cell phones, that, you know, things like that were corrected. So it's a challenge when you're writing, knowing that people have some of these, they already have these impressions. And if people are watching 20th anniversary videos this year, those videos, a lot of them will say that because it's just so accepted that those things. So you're kind of dealing with those kinds of perceptions that you don't have when you're writing about ancient history.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, then they need to read your book so they get the accurate story. So you mentioned journalism school. So we're going to backtrack briefly, because if you don't know Tom, he is an author of this book and some other books, but you wear and have worn many hats, as you're wearing one now, but personally, professionally, you've worn a couple of other hats that are some journalism related, some maybe a little distantly. So give us a little bit on your background.
I went to journalism school. Coming out of high school, they don't give these tests anymore, I don't think, but they chose your career. It was either based on your personality and aptitude. I was either supposed to be a sports writer or a history teacher. So I always loved history, but I went to be a sports writer. I was a newspaper sports writer and talk show host for 18 years. And then I covered a lot of hockey, and the Pittsburgh Penguins hired me as their VP of communications. They wanted somebody from the media to run their media. So I just retired from a 25-year career there. So I worked 43 years in the media marketing world. Yes, it was sports, but that was also storytelling. But on the side, history was always my passion outside of sports. So sometimes people would say, how did this happen? It's always something I followed. It's always something I wanted to do. I never imagined myself writing books. I've now written 3, but this was my first one. And I just, sometimes an opportunity presents itself because no one else is going to do it. And that's kind of what happened. But so I was able to use some of my journalism and writing background here. I didn't come out of I did have background in writing and reporting. That certainly helped. So that it was a little bit of a natural transition for me.
Right. So what drew you to this story? Why did you do it?
I think 9/11 affected me hugely, as it did most people alive. But as a history buff and someone, Shanksville is only about 100 miles from my home in Pittsburgh. It felt personal. It felt not local, but regional. So as one who's tramped battlefields all over the place, I like to go to places where things happen. I drove out there early on, and there was not much to see. It was fenced off. You could get to about 400 yards of the crash site. There were no signs. There was no material. You would just go and felt that something happened. It's the difference of this being in Little Shanksville and not New York City or Washington, D.C. It wasn't the same experience when you went to the Twin Towers site or the Pentagon site.
Sure.
And part, as I'm sure we'll get into later, part of the development of the memorial out there was what the local people did. But I was just drawn to the place, and it developed over the years. I went to the 10th anniversary when they dedicated the first part of the memorial. I just went down there as a citizen. And it just so happened that after that, about 2 weeks later, when you work for a sports team, you get all sorts of requests. We got a letter, not the rest of the people, from the families of Flight 93 to the Pentagon. So I opened it, and it said, "To whom it may concern," he said, the coroner of Somerset County, Wally Miller, has done such a great job for the families. We want to do something nice for him. His passion is the Pittsburgh Penguins. He's a season ticket holder. Can you do something for him at a game? So I'm thinking, how did this happen? So yes, we did. And some of the family members came in. Wally came in, state troopers. And I told them that, I'd been out there. And Wally, being Wally, said, "Why didn't you call me and tell me?" And I said, "Wally, I didn't know you." So but they invited me, and they gave me a special tour. They took me out to the actual crash site, which public can't get to. You can get to about 75 yards, and it's only the families can get out there. But I went early in the morning. They took me out. It was really eerie walking around that site. Wally saying, "This is where I found the hijackers' passports." And my head was spinning. And then they told me they'd done about 200 oral histories already, volunteers out there of first responders, family members, FBI agents. And I said to them, "It's great that you're doing this. This is about 2011, but somebody has to write this." I didn't mean me, but a couple of them had known I used to be a journalist, and they said, well, nobody's tried. Do you want, this information is available if you want to try. That's how it happened. Without that letter coming to the Penguins and coming to my desk, none of this would have happened. So sometimes the lesson is, in leadership or whatever, seize the opportunity. You never know when it's going to come. And they were kind of frustrated that nobody had come and tried to write about this. They were gathering all this information. So I had access to that, and then good access, and one thing led to another. And that's really the story. It was just kind of a quirk of fate that led to that.
It found you.
Yeah,
it sounds like a little bit.
And I felt like I had already done research for the book, because I'd pretty much read everything that had been written about it. I was so interested in the story anyway, just as an observer. I felt like I knew who Wally Miller was before I met him. So I had that advantage, and that it wasn't something that came out of the blue. I had followed the story a little bit, at least. So I had a basis of knowledge, which certainly helped in the research.
Interesting. Okay. Wow. I think what a great story to tell before you tell the story. You know? So as we get into this, I think one thing that really strikes me about 9/11 and 20 years later is I find it sometimes hard to wrap my brain around the fact that there are people out there now in their 20s who either weren't born yet or obviously don't remember it because they were toddlers or young children and it didn't impact them. And I think to myself, it was obviously so momentous, and it impacted everyone around the world if you were, at least in your teens and 20s. And so I think it's important to sometimes also capture our own experiences of where we were on 9/11. I was a sophomore in college at Cabrini College outside of Philadelphia. I heard about it on my little yellow M&M radio that my mom had bought me as I think it was a gag gift, or got it as I don't even know, in my dorm room. And my mom, interestingly, was coming to visit me that day at college. We were supposed to go to lunch and go shopping, and we didn't go to class that day. And the rest of the day was sort of a blur. I do remember my dad was stuck in Spain. He was on a plane leaving Europe and got stranded in Spain for a couple of days. But it is obviously a day that I will not forget, and I will know exactly where I was and exactly what I did. So Tom, for you, what's your 9/11 story? Where were you?
Right before I did that, they did some research. There have been 75 million Americans born since that day. So like a fifth of the country wasn't even alive, much less the young people who don't remember. You're so correct. I was, going to work at the Pittsburgh Penguins office right across from the arena, driving in. And the first plane hit at 8:46. I probably got in just a few minutes before 9. I was a little late for work that day. And I remember I walked in, the receptionist just pointed to the conference room, didn't even say anything. And I walked in, and that's when I first saw the first tower with a big hole in it. And we all saw then the live video of the second plane hitting the second tower. And I think, like most people, thought that was a replay of the early crash. It was so bewildering. And I think the one thing that's important is to try to recapture the absolute bewilderment of that day. I think people now, we know so much of what happened that people now think they knew more on September 11th than they really did.
That's a really good point.
Bewildering and scary it was. Are there more planes, even after Flight 93, which was the last one went down? Are there more planes? Is there going to be the next day, is there going to be another attack? You were so on edge and didn't know what was going on. And that's tough to translate to young people who weren't alive and didn't feel it. I put it the same way as one who studies World War II. I could never feel Pearl Harbor the way my parents did. I know it was important, I know it was scary, but I wasn't alive. And this is kind of our generation of that. If you weren't alive, you can't really understand, but it was complete bewilderment. And we were scared, especially when the third plane hit the Pentagon. That's what really struck me. How could the Pentagon be hit? That's when you knew the country was really under attack. And I think most people were scared.
Absolutely. Yeah. I do. I remember that fear as well. I think I was a little, I was a sophomore in college. And so I think for me, it was also just really hard to even understand what even is, I don't even know what to be scared about right now. Because I was different, I was a little bit younger, but I certainly remember it. And I think it is important to remember.
And so many people parked up by the hockey arena. There's so many parking spaces. There are people who worked in downtown Pittsburgh. And after the third plane hit the tower, I looked out the window, and it was like the city was having a massive fire drill. Like everybody was going home, thousands and thousands of people. going to their cars. And what struck me later is the plane didn't come directly over Pittsburgh, but it was close. At that point, the plane wasn't that far above in the sky that Flight 93. It just,
Right.
no one would have known. It was just so eerie looking back and thinking that, wow, who knows, depending on where that counterattack starts, who knows where it crashes. It just happened that it crashed into an open field. And
Right.
it's all America. And then no one else was injured or killed, as happened in the Pentagon in New York City.